We now take you back to the 9th BRICS Parliamentary Forum at Emperor's Palace in Ekurhuleni. Now, delegates from BRICS nations are in attendance as part of the bloc's commitment to strengthening diplomatic ties. Our reporter Khayelihle Khumalo joins us now from the forum. Good morning, Khayelihle. A bit earlier on when we spoke to our colleague Abria, she gave an indication that possibly the proceedings wouldn't get underway on time. How are we looking for time this hour?
Well, absolutely. So we're supposed to start at 10. So we're just still waiting keenly for the proceedings to get underway. But let's hear from some of the South African MPs who are here. So I'm just going to start with you, Mr. Hlengo from IFP. You're going to be part and parcel of these discussions. Tell us about the significance of today.
Well, it's important that there's follow through to the executive commitments that the president took when the BRICS summit was held a few weeks ago. So parliaments and legislatures obviously have got an oversight responsibility and to hold people to account. There's obviously financial implications. We have to make sure that there's commitment to commitments, and there's also needs to be a follow through insofar as some of the legislative proposals. Amongst others, of course, here we're dealing with the free trade agreement insofar as Africa is concerned, and that is absolutely important, obviously, and it's of significant economic growth and development for South Africa. So this paradigm political shift which is currently at play insofar as the growth of BRICS is concerned does require closer inspection to ensure that whatever is happening is above board, legitimate, and so parliaments need to strengthen their own internal mechanisms insofar as oversight is concerned in this regard. So I think it's a step in the right direction.
And what about the deepening of the cooperation of Parliament within BRICS bloc? What does that mean in terms of making sure that we see these decisions really being implemented?
Well, the strength of any democracy is its checks and balances, and Parliament, particularly in South Africa, must not see itself as an extension of the executive or a rubber stamping institution. So it also needs to undergo its own due processes in terms of whatever is presented, whatever agreements are signed do require public scrutiny, because the representatives of the people are actually in Parliament. So it is important that Parliament reposition itself and then benchmark correctly with the BRICS partners in terms of what they are doing, so that you level the playing fields, because what would be irresponsible is to allow the executive to be a runaway train without parliamentary legislative oversight.
All right, so thank you so much indeed. And of course, Mfundo, quite a number of MPs as well. Let's hear now from the EFF, their Deputy President is here. So Mr. Shibamba, once again, thank you so much indeed for your time. Tell us about your presence here today and what does it mean for EFF to finally have this opportunity to be part of these important sessions around this influential bloc within the Global South?
Now look, as the economic freedom fighters who have been participating in the BRICS Parliamentary Forum, it's not the first time. So in the sidelines of the Interparliamentary Union's 143rd Assembly in Madrid in Spain, we actually had played one of the most significant roles in the SADC and the BRICS Parliamentary Forum. So we have been always associating with these BRICS parliamentary platforms, and we have almost always encouraged that the South African Parliament should be at the forefront of promoting the collaboration and cooperation between the BRICS nations. And perhaps what is different with this parliamentary forum is that we're now beginning to see the participation of the BRICS plus 6 countries and nation states. The delegation from the United Arab Emirates is here, from Ethiopia, from the other countries who have now been resolved by the BRICS summit to be forming part of the BRICS bloc. And it's a progressive platform which must be encouraged, because in the original conceptualization of BRICS, it must not just be government-to-government relations. It must be people-to-people relations, parliament-to-parliament. There must be many other activities as well that are promoted within the Global South to challenge the global hegemony of the West, and that is what the EFF stands for. So we, as the EFF, are comfortably in these spaces.
What about your expectations in terms of the deliverables? I mean, you look at the commissions, the issues of climate change, and also making sure that the executive do implement the outcomes of the 15th summit that was held here in South Africa.
Look, there are so many common issues which we have to commonly pursue as BRICS nations in the world. And of course, there's an issue of climate change as to just how do we approach the whole question, because the master narrative now on climate change has been driven by Western government and forces, and imperialist forces who have got narrow and selfish interests, which in most instances undermine the energy security of the countries that they give advice to. So the BRICS nation must come up with clear perspective as to just how do we deal with climate change, but also there must be a common perspective on the reform of the United Nations. So I think we must utilize these platforms to call for the total overhaul of the United Nations Security Council, to have greater participation, particularly of the African countries, because we've got more than 1 billion people in Africa, but we do not have any meaningful participation in the United Nations. So we must lobby our friends in a BRICS Parliamentary Forum that perhaps in the next General Assembly of the United Nations, we should table a concrete program on how we get to reform the United Nations. But otherwise, there are so many issues that we can deliberate on and give clearer perspective, and I'm sure that we will be able to achieve that. But the last issue, of course, which is important, is that South Africa has to consolidate the views of the African continent and not relate with BRICS nations just as one country. We should lobby for pan-continental infrastructure programs and activities and infrastructure that is going to integrate the African continent, because at the center of the EFF's existence is the ultimate integration of the entire African continent. And that is the voice that we're going to resonate in this platform.
All right, so thank you so much indeed for your time. So a perspective there from the EFF. But now let's hear from COPE. Their leader, Mr. Delegates, is here with us, Fundo. So thank you so much indeed for your time. So maybe just your reaction to today's proceedings. Everyone is keenly waiting for the proceedings to get underway, but most importantly, what are your expectations ahead of today?
Well, the central issue here is that South Africa is generally seen as the leading country in Africa. And indeed, when we look at the continent, we do think that it's important that we must play a big role in consolidating the unity of the Africans, linked that to the developing countries, so that we are able to ease ourselves out of the colonial past, which reduced Africa and African countries to second-placed citizens of the world. Would like to see a strengthening of the forward movement and growth of the BRICS community, so that we are able to uplift the conditions of the people of Africa.
And just in terms of the role of Parliament, in terms of pushing economic development, I mean, for example, South Africa says its destinies very much intrinsically linked with that of the African continent. Hence, this partnership for BRICS to work for the African continent. What can parliaments do to make sure that we do see the outcomes really being implemented?
Within the community of Africa and African countries, it is critical that South Africa strengthens relations between itself and the other countries of Africa. That collectively, out of that, we are able to develop the strength of the continent, to link up with sister countries, and that we can match the pace of development elsewhere in the world, and that Africa therefore conquers the right place for itself.
All right, Mr. Delegates, thank you so much indeed. Of course, Fundo, that's the leader of COPE, but I do understand that now the proceedings just got underway, so I'm just going to take you right inside where the National Assembly Speaker, Nosivia Mapisa Ngagwela, is just starting the proceedings here at Emperor's Palace.